Thank you for joining us as we recognize Black History Month. To enjoy more library programming like this for you and your family, subscribe to DC Public Library on YouTube, download the DCPL app, and follow us at DCPL on Facebook and Twitter. Take care.
Hello, I'm Erin Haynes, editor-at-large of The 19th at 19thnews.org. I'm thrilled to host this conversation with the DC Public Library in celebration of Black History Month. This February, the DC Public Library celebrates the culture and accomplishments of African American communities through the viewpoint of the Black family. The definition of family, like Black life and culture itself, is multifaceted. The family we make, build, or choose provides comfort, encouragement, and inspiration for African Americans to thrive, no matter the obstacle. And today's conversation in so many ways feels like a family reunion itself, as these are close friends, colleagues, and mentors of mine. As the family of Black journalists and the organization we are a part of, the National Association of Black Journalists, honors an author and what was his life's work, the latest award-winning book, The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X by Les Payne. Before we get started, I want to introduce our panelists for tonight's conversation. Tamara Payne, daughter of Les Payne, who, following her father's death, heroically completed this biography. Tamara served as Les Payne's principal researcher. Les was a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and former editor at Newsday. A founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, he also wrote an award-winning syndicated column. Next, we have Rochelle Riley, who ended a 20-year career as a nationally syndicated award-winning Detroit columnist in 2019 to become the City of Detroit's Director of Arts and Culture. In that role, she guides the city's investment in the arts and creates opportunities for transformative artistic expression and support. Her most recent project was the nation's first citywide memorial to victims of COVID-19, 15 funeral processions that circled the city's Belle Isle past, 907 photo billboards of victims. But Rochelle also remains a writer, and her latest book, That They Lived, African Americans Who Changed the World, hits bookstores this month. And last but certainly not least, we have Dwayne Wickham, founding dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communications at Morgan State University. Prior to coming to Morgan State, Dwayne served as interim chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at North Carolina A&T State University. He's also served as a distinguished professor of journalism at Delaware State University and a visiting distinguished professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Wickham began his journalism career in the summer of 1973 as a copy editing intern with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Over the next 42 years, he worked for the Baltimore Sun, U.S. News and World Report, Black Enterprise Magazine, CBS News, BET News, and USA Today, where he wrote a nationally syndicated opinion column for 30 years. He's a founding member and former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, which gave him its Lifetime Achievement Award in 2012. In 2016, Wickham was inducted into the NABJ Hall of Fame. With that, I want to get started. And Tamara, obviously, I want to open with you because your father really lived and breathed this story and this relationship for more than a generation. And so I wonder if you can start by just telling us about Les Payne's relationship with Malcolm X and why he wanted to tell this story.
Sure, thank you, Erin. My father, Les Payne, he started on the story back in 1990. And prior to 1990, he didn't think that there needed to be a biography needed to be written about Malcolm X, actually. He felt that the autobiography, as well as Malcolm's speeches, which were being reprinted and republished at that time, were all we needed. And that was everything we needed to know. But being the journalist that he is, and a journalist to his core, and always looking for the story, and what's new and what's not easily discovered about people, things and places and events happening in our lives. He met one of Malcolm's brothers in Detroit through a friend of his childhood friend, Walter Evans, who was a surgeon in Detroit, and introduced him to one of the brothers. And my father, fascinated, and not unusual. When he would meet somebody of interest, he would immediately say, "Hey, let's sit down and talk." And he convinced them to sit down and talk, and he interviewed him for 8 hours. He actually even taped that interview. And he was just fascinated by that. And when he came back to New York, he was processing what he had learned from that interview. And he went on to talk to another colleague of his here in New York, Gil Noble, who hosted a show called Like It Is. And Gil Noble, also a fan of Malcolm X, said that, asked him, which brother did you speak with? And my father told him it was Filbert. And Gil Noble said, the brother you should speak to is Wilfred. So Dad said, okay, I'm going back to Detroit. And he met Wilfred and sat down with him for another 8 hours and taped that interview. And again, and this is in 1990 when he did these interviews. And I actually had been in China. I was finishing up my own teaching stint there. And when I came home to visit, my father was just talking endlessly about these interviews. And he said, there's so much about Malcolm we don't know. And what he came away from those two interviews was learning about who Malcolm was as a child, what his family was like, what the household chores were like, and growing up in the household, but also growing up a son of parents who followed Marcus Garvey and were organizers for his organization. So what did that mean? What kind of framework did that set up for Malcolm? And so what he came away with was like, we don't know really who Malcolm is as a person. We understand what he said and how he analyzed our situation in America and white supremacy and confronting it and dealing with ourselves as Black people in this country and how to thrive. But we don't know who he is as the person. And he also felt that we needed to understand the world Malcolm grew up in, because Malcolm to that time was presented as fully formed and angry, as if he sprung out of nowhere. And so he said, we need to know this story. We need to understand him more completely, and to understand, because yes, he has influenced many people from himself and a lot of the actions that he's taken. And I'm sure Dwayne Whitcomb will attest to this, that even the founding of the National Association of Black Journalists was in the light and in the practices of Malcolm and his influences on them, protecting themselves in this industry of journalism, but also passing on the craft to younger Black people, Black students in particular. So, but who is Malcolm? And what was the world he was born into? Because again, in this story, what we find is that as much as who Malcolm and his parents and his siblings were, and then everybody else he comes into contact with, like, you know, Elijah Muhammad, Marcus Garvey, Jeremiah Shabazz, everybody else, we also need to put in the context of the environment and the history of that was going on, because history, because of the circumstances, forces people to make certain choices. And how do they make those choices and why? And taking that and putting it in context helps us to understand who Malcolm is and why he's so important to us and how he still impacts us today.
Well, Tamara brings you up, Dwayne, so I'm going to come to you next. Because I do want to ask about, Malcolm X's influence on your life and how his example and his, kind of bold and unapologetic leadership, how that factored into maybe what you and your co-founders thought about when you founded the National Association of Black Journalists. I mean, to Tamara's point just now, history forces us to make certain choices. And I think that you all found yourselves at a crossroads when you were deciding to form the organization that has shaped and supported and raised so many of us, myself included.
Well, you know, what is remarkable about this discussion is that 6 months before the founding of NABJ, in June of 1975, Les Payne was in Mozambique. And from Mozambique, he wrote me a letter. He was commenting on the independence that had occurred in Mozambique. I want to read you some of this, because at the end of it, you see how he frames everything against Malcolm X. So from Mozambique, he writes about the independence. He said, I've only been here 3 days, and though I've seen only Maputo, but it feels vibrant and liberated. The struggle, of course, is not over here, but the signs are everywhere that there has been one. Frelimo is in control, and this fact puts much distance between Mozambique and other African countries sub-Sahara. Most of them, in the throes of neo-colonialism, have merely been decolonialized. Mozambique has been liberated. The difference is that between a free man and a freed man, between India and China, Mao and Gandhi, and without making too depressing a bill, the difference between Malcolm X and Roy Wilkins. And so even in 1975, he had this consciousness that Malcolm was somehow different. And I think it is what kept his attention on Malcolm. And I know we talk about when he first launched this book Pursuit in real time, but I think always in the back of his consciousness was this notion that he needed to know more, that we needed to know more about Malcolm. I mean, as kids, and I'm sure maybe Rochelle can say something about this too, but as youngsters, I remember going into the basement of my friends' homes, and we would listen to Malcolm X's records, and hear his speeches, and we'd all go out and try to quote him. But we weren't sure what that meant, other than it was kind of like forbidden fruit. The family kept those records set aside somewhere, the adults would put them aside, and when they were away, we'd listen to them. But Les always had this consciousness about Malcolm, which is amazing to me. I mean, Les Payne, a captain, Ranger Army captain in Vietnam. I mean, he was the quintessential straight-laced guy who was the press aide to General William Westmoreland, the commander-in-chief of military forces in Vietnam at the height of the Vietnam War. And he came home, a guy who was not, in obvious ways at least, not somehow harmed by the war, but certainly enlightened by the sense of struggle, because there was a liberation struggle in South Vietnam. And he became, I think, really aware of the liberation struggle that was taking place in this country. And he put Malcolm X in that context.
Yeah. And so then, Black journalists, being tied to the liberation struggle and NABJ being birthed.
Yeah. And so when we formed NABJ 6 months later, the night of our creation, there was this great debate, this heated debate about structure. We had all agreed that we would have this organization, and everybody weighed in. Les was involved, Asa Moore, others, Joe Davidson. And then we came to a point where Chuck Stone, the real force behind the creation of the organization, started talking about how we would structure the organization. And I remember Les saying, at that point, he was through with it. He was saying, hell with this, let's just do something. Because he was in that way very much like Malcolm. He wanted to get something done and didn't want to be bogged down by structure. As structure can so often bog us down, and has historically done so.
Yeah. Well, Rochelle, I want to bring you into this because obviously Malcolm X, aka Detroit Red, in his younger days, right, means that there's obviously you can't talk about Malcolm X without talking about his connection to Detroit. And so, I wonder for you what your relationship was to Malcolm X when you were younger, and then how, encountering Les as he is starting to uncover and conceive of and start to create this book. How did that change your perspective on who Malcolm X was, or how you saw Malcolm X through Les's eyes?
Well, I can tell you I'm about a decade behind Dean Wickham. And so by the time we were studying Malcolm X, he was considered the leader who would get into bad trouble, while Martin Luther King was the one getting into good trouble. And it took someone who actually did the actual reporting, the actual contextual study of him to understand. And if you've got somebody who's working on a project for 30 years, you learn as you go. You have to understand that for the whole time that I knew Les Payne, he was studying Malcolm and sharing about Malcolm. It was almost as if he were his spirit continued, so that you always were hearing something about Malcolm. And so that's why people kept wanting to, we kept saying, when are you going to finish the book? Because we were dying to know all that he knew. And I have to tell you, if there's anything that gives you a true sense of who Les Payne was as a professional, it was his study of this particular man. If a reporter had been sent to cover the OK Corral and what happened, you get a story that said 3 were killed and 3 were injured, according to a witness. If you send Les, he would have talked to everybody who was there and their families and the people who had heard about it and anybody who had talked about it. And then he would have done the background on all the people who were killed. So not only would you know everything about their lives, but you would understand why they were there, what they meant, the mistakes they made, and what it would mean to everybody else who lost them or who was studying it. You got a true sense. I mean, and even with everything you think you know about Malcolm, and again, my all of my study of Malcolm is study. I came along, quite frankly, as an adult after his death. So I read this book and it was with fresh eyes. It was with a renewed look at someone that I thought I knew. And that's the gift that Les Payne has given us.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about his thoroughness as a journalist, the rigor that he brought to every story that he told, and so you would expect no less from a work like this. And Dwayne, I want to come back to you before I come to you, Tamara, because I, as a student journalist, met Les Payne, Founder Payne, as I knew him and was able to learn from him and had the privilege of being, mentored by him and to get advice from one of the founders of our esteemed organization. But you were there in the beginning, as opposed to me, who met him kind of on the back end of his career. And so, pick up where Rochelle is leaving off for folks who didn't really have the honor and the pleasure of really knowing him. What struck you about the type of journalist that he was?
Well, as Rochelle has pushed the calendar, I can't pick up there. I need to go back 10 years. But Les and I met in 1975, and our journalism paths, I think, aligned very closely. We were both Vietnam veterans, and so I think that helped to build some kinship between us. And we talked a lot about the craft of journalism. And the reason why we had so many conversations about the craft is because Les didn't talk to too many other people about the practice of journalism. Les's philosophy about journalism, and I saw it in play in 1976 when we went to Cincinnati to cover the caucus of Black Democrats and to Cincinnati to cover the National Black Political Assembly, an attempt to form a third political party in this country and run both a national political candidate for president. Les's position, and we're all queued up there. That must have been 30 or 40 Black journalists. That was pretty much the lot in those days. Les's position was there's never a story where you see a crowd of journalists. And so while everyone was covering the actors, the Black activists, the Young Turks, the old folks from the NAACP would all come together to try to bring about this third political party, Les always was nipping about at the edges. Because he thought that's where the story was. You got to pull somebody aside. If you ever encountered Les at a press conference, the thing that's remarkable about him is that he never asked a question. He felt he wasn't going to do reporting for others. He was there to pick up a sense of what was going on, to get load his quiver for later engagement with the principals. But he didn't show his cards there. He was a loner in a journalistic sense. From his coverage of the Symbionese Liberation Army, if you remember those days when there was an effort to bring about a violent revolution that was interracial. Most of the participants of the Symbionese Liberation Army were white. The leadership was Black. They kidnapped Patty Hearst, as you remember famously, and converted her to their cause. Les went out to cover them by himself. He didn't travel with other journalists who were queuing up in San Francisco and the Bay Area, and then later down in LA. He always traveled that lone road because he always thought that that's where the real news was. And so that's the lesson I learned from Les, and I picked up that from him as well. he was uniquely different in his quest for knowledge. He would quote H.L. Mencken.
Yeah.
No black journalist quotes H.L. Mencken. We all came away thinking, we grew up thinking H.L. Mencken was a racist. And then when Les became the first black journalist to give the H.L. Mencken address at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, he famously took me to task in front of the assembled masses there to talk about how he and I had gone back and forth about Mencken's racism. And then he pointed out the publication called The Sage of Harlem, which he read and got me to read, which is a book about all the things that H.L. Mencken did to help black writers during the Harlem Renaissance and later. So he was a guy who always went to work heavily armed intellectually, and that pushed me to immerse myself deeply in reading and studying about the issues that I wanted to cover. And now I pass that on to other folks as I talk to young journalists. Do not enter the room thinking that you can make it as a jack of all trades. You need to be a specialist, and you need to understand the issues that you cover, which is why Les was so deeply embedded, not only in the search for answers about Malcolm X, but also about Martin Luther King. He wrote famously about raising questions about the King assassination, so much so that he pushed Congress to reopen the investigation and to produce another report, although he wasn't quite happy with the results of the report. But his work, his reporting, his going to Memphis, in fact, maybe this may have been the one time he had a buddy system, because I went with him. He and I both went to Memphis looking for a source there who was a lieutenant in the fire department, the station being located very close to the Lorraine Hotel. And we thought that this black lieutenant, had witnessed something that would be instrumental in helping us figure out what had happened. And so he was always chasing the story behind the story, the untold story, the unreported story, the story that was not easily found and often ignored by the traditional press.
Yeah. I will tell you that was also a lesson that I got from him, was to zig when everybody else was zagging. That was that was definitely his superpower as a journalist.
Yeah.
Tamara, I want to come back to you because
Sure.
we've been hearing about just kind of how Malcolm X was a figure that loomed large, kind of in your father's consciousness even before he took on this story. But I wonder, because you were somebody who worked so intimately with him on this amazing work, this award-winning work, can you talk to me about what working with him on this story was like, and what you learned about your father through this process?
Working with Dad, for me, it was a challenge that I really wanted to take on, because I wanted to learn how he practiced journalism. I mean, I could have gone to journalism school, but I had my father right there for me, and I admired the work that he had been producing, and I admired the relationship that people who worked under my father had with him, and their admiration for him as one of the best managers and editors for them. And Dad, he was about not just being a specialist in a topic, for example, a topic of pursuing in journalism, particularly. I remember when in the 80s and 90s, he would say that, we need more journalists who understand economics, because that was one of his weak points. But he said that we need more journalists to understand that, to break this down in their stories about how the economy is important, and it covers in all the stories, whether you're talking about medical, issues, or whatever the stories are. But for me, watching that from afar was one thing, but having the opportunity to work up close with him, understanding how he looked at sourcing, and that everybody was a source. You don't turn, you leave no stone unturned, and it doesn't matter how small, the details that people give you. We did so many interviews, for this, and I say it was hundreds of hours of interviews. I mean, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's 150 or 300 hours. What I'm saying is that, some of these interviews were just They could have been 5 minutes of just note taking, but they also were long interviews for 8 hours that we recorded. And then it was also the re-interviews. You don't just interview a person one time and just say that's their story. Dad used to always talk about, in order to be a good journalist, you need to have, well, I don't want to use the curse word, but you need to know when people are lying.
I think we take
You need to have a meter for lies.
yes.
and he had a very good one. And he taught me to really trust my own instincts and intuition. He's like, you have a strong intuition. And so working with him, the encouragement of working with somebody, my father, who has my best interests at heart, and also he's passing on a craft to me that he's also passing on to you, Aaron, and shared with Dwayne and Rochelle and anybody else who was interested. He had no problem sharing this information. And he said, there's no big I, little you. We're all here in this together. And it's important that we understand this. And I also want to make it, really clear too. One of the reasons why he got into journalism, what he picked out from working in Vietnam, was that journalism, not only is it, what it became was like the first line of telling history as it was happening, but being able to pick up information and getting it confirmed and making sure that it's correct and giving that to the people under, within a free press that's protected by the US Constitution is important. And that was what was behind and everything he was doing in journalism. He was committed to that to the end. And even in watching how journalism was changing over the years, and especially after he had retired, he still would fight and encourage people to stay committed to that ideal. Even though your bosses and your editors may be changing, may be asking different things of you, but it is nothing wrong with you having that authentic idea of staying committed to your goal of informing people so that people can make informed decisions and we're seeing what happens right now, what happens when people don't have the correct information. So, but for me, it was really learning about how do you do that correctly, and how do you do that strengthfully. You have to go forth and be committed to this. And it was constant. There were times I was finding sources. I had to go out and find people who knew Malcolm, and I was running in those circles, and some of them were killers and some of them were, security guards. Some of them were committed just politically to be with Malcolm. And, and I have, all kinds of stories learning, and all the stories are so interesting. So for me, being able to, knowing that Dad called this his life's work, and being committed to making sure it saw publication, and that his voice is resounding throughout this work, it's so important to me, and was the commitment I wanted to make sure I finished off for my father. But there are so many other stories that I plan on working on too that is still part of this work, because it's affected me. I've been on this for 30 years. While he was working on for 28, I was on it for 30.
Yeah, you are the one who got this across the finish line, and that is something that cannot be overstated, just as it cannot be overstated, really, the importance of the relentless pursuit of the truth, the healthy respect for the facts, right? And the importance of free and fair press in this country.
And understanding too that sometimes the story is not going to be what you want it to be, and there are going to be times that the facts don't show what people want, are expecting, and you have to kind of go with those stories. And that was the real lesson I was learning from my father. And I love listening to Rochelle and Dwayne talk about that too.
Well, I love listening to you because just even as the things that you're recounting just now in your answer just remind me of so many of the things that he also passed along to me in our conversations when I was, he was generous enough to as Dwayne said, actually talk about journalism and give advice to somebody who was trying to do what he had done so well and for so long. So as people have talked about here tonight, Tamara, this is a new story about Malcolm X, and so many Black Americans, so many Americans are familiar with, obviously the autobiography is told to Alex Haley, or even Denzel Washington's iconic portrayal in Spike Lee's movie X. I just wonder what what would you say is the main thing that readers are really going to learn and take away about Malcolm X in this book that they haven't known before from yet? Because I think people think that they know everything that there is to know, as has been said earlier.
Yeah, one thing I've come to understand is you can't, I mean, some people call this a definitive book. I wouldn't say that. I don't believe that you can write a definitive work because you don't know what is definitive at the end of the day. I think that what you come away from this work, and it's a more nuanced portrayal of Malcolm and who he was as a person as he walked the planet, and the world that he lived in, and how that world impacted not only him but everybody around him, and why, for example, do you have the Moorish Science Temple? Why Marcus Garvey's movement was so important to the Black community who were escaping from the South, going up north, for better opportunities, and escaping, in a lot of cases, lynchings and violence, and wanting to have a better life and thriving and creating opportunities for their future generations. And why not? But then only to come across even more, not just racism, but obstacles in their place, and white supremacy expressed in different ways in the North. You had exclusionary clauses, which the Little family came across when they moved to Lansing, when they purchased land, that in the deed, there's actual exclusion clause that says that Black people couldn't own that land. And they were evicted by their white neighbors who did not want the Littles to be in that neighborhood. And then after they were evicted, the house was burnt down. And then soon after that, Malcolm's father dies in a streetcar accident, unfortunately. And so when people wonder, well, why did Malcolm believe that his father was killed by the Klan? Right, already we're talking about an environment where you have your white neighbors pushing you off this property that you honestly bought, so you thought, and now there are these laws that all of a sudden everybody's looking at the laws and using that against you. And this is still happening today, obviously, but this is what happened in late 1920s to the Little family. This is just one example of many others. But in this particular case, there you have that. And then you also have people when Earl Little passes away in the streetcar accident, you have other people who want to further, create dissension and anger and fear in the Little family. And they say, well, we take responsibility for the killing of Earl Little. Mm-hmm. And Malcolm's mother heard this, Malcolm hears this, but the reason why we say it wasn't that the Klan killed Earl Little is because Wilfred was there. He was 12 years old when the cops came to his home. He actually saw his father's body. He heard the story of the cop explain to his mother what had happened. And, and you have to go with that. Then we had talked with other people who were in Lansing, who were there at the time. There was one person who actually was on the streetcar and actually validated the story that we had been hearing about that Earl Little had slipped under he was not being chased down by the Klan or anything like that. And so these are the stories that, you kind of say, okay, well, this is what happened. Then Malcolm continues to believe it. And Wilfred and Phil would talk about. Well, Malcolm kept talking about that. He wouldn't let that go. He believed that to the end of his days. But the rest of the family did not. And those were some of the stories that we came across. Another I would look at is the opening of the book, where the family is in Omaha, Nebraska, and their parents are organizers for the UNIA movement. And Earl Little is in another town organizing other families. And Louise Little is there with her 3 kids. And they're visited upon by the local Klansmen. And they don't like the activities that, the Little family are participating in organizing other Black families, making them proud, making them more conscious. They don't want that. These are bad Black people. We want good Negroes, right? So they visit upon them. They want to chase them out of town. And Louise stands her ground in front of her children. And Wilfred witnesses this. Philbert witnesses this. And, and hearing the detail of how Wilfred remembers that incident, and he's a grown man when he tells Dad this story. And it never leaves him. It never leaves him. And these, again, and also keep in mind, this happened in the early 20s, but in 1919 was the Will Brown lynching that I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing about lately. In 1919 was part of the Red Summer of 1919, where many Black people were being lynched, and the coming back of World War I veterans, who fought for American freedoms abroad, come back home, and they want their own freedoms. And America's trying to say, no, you don't deserve that, even though you fought for our freedoms. And so we're going to make an example of you, and we're going to, and they made those examples. And I mean, it's just horrifying when you read that incident that happened with Will Brown, in Omaha. And that happened in 1919. The little family moves there a few years after that. The Klansmen visiting the little family is a reverberation of that incident, of that activity, of this energy. And this energy has not been fully confronted and dealt with in this country, and we're still dealing with it today. But it's important to understand that this has been going on. This is not new. It has not been fully dealt with, but it keeps happening. So how did we get here? What is the history? Let's deal with this. Now we have an opportunity to really deal with this and not repeat the mistakes of the past by ignoring it and saying, oh, it'll go away. Because it's not. It keeps coming back.
Yeah, I love what you are saying about, really putting Malcolm X in context and just the commitment to reporting that gets us away from the mythology. A lot of the mythology, frankly, that I think is around Malcolm X, and really just kind of grounds him, his family, his story, but also the times in which he existed and how that shaped who he was and how he became who he came to be. So, all of you saw this book being conceived at various points over the years and it consuming less. And I want to talk about that too in the time that we have left, because the book had a bit of a life of its own. It really sounds like,
for me, it's like a sibling.
Right, exactly. Seriously. So Rochelle and Dwayne, I wonder if you both, I know both of you have specific memories of Les sharing, parts of the book as he was working through this process. Why don't you tell us a little bit about a time that you remember him, just sharing a section of this story with you, and what that was like because I know you were eager for those tidbits as he was going along the way. Rochelle, you and then we'll come.
It was often my experience that Les would share portions of the book with me. He was something of a tease, by the way. He'd give you just enough to whet your appetite, so you wouldn't be a part of that crowd standing off to the side saying, he's never gonna finish that book. Where's that book? He would just give you enough that you would say, oh man, you've got to get this book out. On one occasion, we were in Jackson, Mississippi. We were going down to spend some time as members of the Trotter Group, that organization of African-American columnists and commentators that Les and Derek Jackson and I created. We were visiting Jackson State, and Les there read, it was the longest portion of the book that I've ever heard him read. And it was probably, I would say, maybe 7 or 8 pages. He read that portion where Malcolm was on his way into, I believe it was Connecticut, for a meeting to bring together some members of some people into the nation. And he read it like with so much verve. I mean, he did the voices in the way that a Bostonite, a Bostonian, I should say, a Bostonian, with the accent of a Bostonian. That's what I'm trying to say. And it was amazing when the conductor called out the stops, and he did it with that accent. And I thought, this man owns this story now. But I think the most important thing about the book for me, if I might go there, is that the book is totally devoid of literary devices. He tells a story. It's a compelling story. It's a detailed story. It's a story he worked on for 28 years. He didn't have to have any quick devices. It unfolds in a way that is that makes you want to read a 400 or 500 page book. Mm-hmm. There are books that are written that long, but there are few that are read. You pick up this book, you can't turn it down. You anticipate the turning of the page. And so I found that to be very fascinating for me. It was very revealing, and I thought I knew a lot about Malcolm X through my reading of the autobiography of Malcolm X, and also through listening to Les tell pieces. But he was a guy who was obsessed with getting every detail, even when the occasion of my retirement from USA Today in August of 2015 at the NABJ convention, and USA Today did a special dinner party for me, at which Les was to be the keynote speaker. And Les, I don't remember which brother he found, but on that evening, he found one of Malcolm's brothers in Minnesota. And he called me and he says, he apologized. He said, I cannot come. And explained to me why. And I said, I understand. And so we had to quickly find another keynote speaker for my occasion. But he was always sharply focused on getting the story and telling the story in its fullness. And for me, that's the real gift of this book, the fullness of the story that he tells.
Yeah, well, anticipating the turning of the page could not be higher praise for an author, I would think. Rochelle, what about you? What is the memory that you have of him sharing this journey with you as it was coming into fruition?
Well, I can tell you two things. One is there's a reason why this book won the National Book Award. It's because it's not just that it's one of the most well-reported sagas that has been written, but it's because Les Payne was a great writer. I mean, literally, he would literally write something, and on every page he would stop and say, "Oh man, I wish I'd written that," and he did it that way. And the book is not just about Malcolm X; it's about the story of America. So when you're talking about somebody who's able to contextualize our lives as a part of this man's life, that's not something that everybody can do. This is a reporter who taught us to talk to secretaries and janitors and talk to people who are not a part of the main story. This is a man who literally would know everything about something before he would put, pen to paper to the notebook and hit the computer. He would write something like, "No other gate on earth slams with the finality of a prison gate." He didn't just write "a prison gate closes." He would write such spirit and such amazement. And I'll tell you one of the great moments, well, there were two, because I had a similar experience as Dwayne. We were all sitting around Derek Jackson's house in Cambridge, hanging out at Harvard at a Trotter meeting. And once again, we just cajoled and begged and said, "Could you read us a little bit?" And he read a passage, and it was the passage about the Klan coming to the door. But the lights were dimmed. We're sitting around the dining room table. I asked him if I could take it, and he said, "I don't care." And he read that, and I listened to that tape several times, because it wasn't just somebody reading an excerpt from a book. It was somebody who was giving you a little bit of something that no one else had, no one else knew, no one else could tell in that way. And it was mesmerizing. And I will never forget that for as long as I live. But the other thing, and it's more mundane, but it was very important to me. We were at an NABJ convention because we were there every year. And I was like one of those pups that would follow Les around because he's Les Payne. When I became a columnist, and I will never remember what I wrote, but he said, "That was a good column." That was it for me. That's all I ever needed to hear. That Les Payne was a good column. So I should have found that column and framed it, but it didn't matter. I wrote something that he thought was great, and he changed my life by saying that. So that's what it meant for me. He reintroduced me to someone. He reintroduced me to writing. He reintroduced me to the craft of telling a story. But he also made it clear that nobody exists in a void. So if you're going to write about somebody, you better put them someplace. And he put Malcolm in America.
Absolutely. And because he really inhabited this story, I think that is the reason that you end up with something that is so engaging, so engrossing, and really just brings us all into the world of Malcolm X. And so not only is this book a gift, but as all of you, I hope, have realized by now, this journalist was a gift to us all. And Tamara, thank you and your family so much for sharing him with us for so long. Even a minute, was really so much to get from this man and all that he gave and poured into all of us. So I think that this is a great note to end this on. On behalf of the DC Public Library, I want to thank Tamara, Dwayne, Rochelle, and obviously the late Les Payne for gifting us with this great work and legacy. You can find Les's book, The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X, here at the DC Public Library, as well as at your local bookstores. And be sure to please follow DC Public Library on social media, download the new DCPL app, or subscribe to DC Library content on YouTube for more virtual programming like this. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe and take care.